Here's our host, Jian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin in Athens, where China and Greece have signed a total of 16 business agreements. Chinese President Xi Jinping kicked off the three-day state visit on Sunday. It's the first visit by a Chinese leader to Greece in 11 years. President Xi had talks with the Greek president and the prime minister of the country. During the talks, the leaders have touched on something that both countries share: deep history with civilizations that date back to ancient times. In a joint media conference with visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping, he and the Greek Prime Minister expressed the importance of working together on the Belt and Road Initiative. Take a listen.
Both sides see China and Greece as natural partners for building the Belt and Road. We would like to mesh the Belt and Road Initiative more closely with the development strategy of this country. We look forward to implementing cooperation plans in priority areas and to fully leverage the transshipment role of the port of Piraeus and to further strengthen the transportation capacity of the China-Europe Land-Sea Express Line. I'm sure we'll make the most of the Joint Committee on Economy and Trade and continually expand two-way trade and mutual investment, and to unleash the potential in energy, transportation, and financial cooperation.
And this marks the important thing in the day. I'm talking about the signing of 16 government and business agreements between Greece and China and many levels and many different sectors. So this is a road that we've now opened, but this road will soon become a highway because our bilateral collaboration will become even stronger.
For what's the potential of China and Greece ties, and what does it mean for the European continent and beyond? We are joined in Brussels by Peter Klepp, who's the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, and in our Beijing studio, Wang Yiwei, the Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies at the Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Professor Wang, a lot to be celebrated between China and Greece, and this time, the port, the deep sea port, is of quite significance, Professor.
Definitely, this is a flagship project under the Belt and Road Initiative. Originally, I think it's China's investment during the Greece debt crisis serious period because of the privatization, and China's investment cost from COSCO make this the port from the bankruptcy now to #1 in the Mediterranean Sea, ranking from number 93 now so to number, I think, 32 in the world. So I think it's contribute directly at least 3,000 jobs, and indirectly 10,000. So they contribute a lot for the local, because of the port connect now the North Africa, Middle East, and Europe, and also contribute to the south-north logistic link. Traditionally, the Europeans logistically is more from the Hamburg and Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and to the from the west to the east. So the South European countries, Central Median countries, they are suffer. So logistic costs is quite high. So this is very good for the 17+1 cooperation.
And Mr. Klepp, of course, that probably means more opportunities and also competitions for Rotterdam and also some of the ports in Germany as well. So how do you see that, the rise of Piraeus in Greece as one important port as it used to be?
Well, competition is, of course, a good thing, and Greece is definitely a country that could use a lot of investment. So it's no surprise that Greece is very keen to have closer ties with China. There is a lot of unease, however, about this, both at the EU level and in the United States. The US has been claiming that some countries go into debt too deeply to China, which then gives leverage to China. The EU is not happy with this so-called 16+1 cooperation, so basically Central and Eastern European countries that have set up a certain format to have closer ties with China.
I see.
Now, I think ultimately, as long as countries make sure that they don't go into debt excessively, then I mean, it's of course a great idea to have closer trade ties with anyone, and certainly with China, which is one of the major economic powers of today.
Mr. Klepp, I'm sure you are informed about the speech made by the Greek Prime Minister when he was attending the China International Import Expo. The Prime Minister from Greece particularly talked about the debt issue, in which he illustrated that the earlier heavy debt shouldered by Greece as a result of its economic challenges has become much less than it used to be so far. So it's kind of interesting to see a Greek perspective. We were hoping also to be able to connect to some of the panelists in Greece. For now, we're still working on the telecommunication issue. But Professor Wang, let me go to you also about that. You know, there are certain perceptions involving China's interaction with the European countries, including this time the cooperation on Port Piraeus in Greece. So how do you see these debates, both inside the EU and so-called warnings coming from other parts of the world?
Well, European Union, 28 countries, but actually 17 of them, including Greece, suffered with the less development in recent years. So-called two words, the developing country or developed country, even in the European Union. So those countries actually, they cannot pay much attention to Brussels because Brussels suffered a debt crisis. So they look to the east. So more the Chinese investment can contribute the job creation and also tax. Also, it's good for the long-term economic prosperity and the mutual connectivity. But in total, actually, for instance, in the Greece, I think the FDI, the attract from abroad, China's investment only 1%. So it's very limited. So still a huge space. So that's more the need investment from not just from China, from European Union, other countries as well.
So it's kind of interesting to see the different opinions inside the EU, but of course it is really the countries themselves that really count the most. Mr. Klepp, according to the latest statistics coming from a survey done by some of the US survey groups, talking about China is most favored in the eyes of Greece, only next to some of the other Eastern European countries. So 51% actually in Greece favor China. It's interesting to see how you know, China is being seen in different countries by different people in different ways, Mr. Klepp.
Yes, that's very much the case. If you look at this so-called 16+1 cooperation, so Central and Eastern European countries, there Greece is actually more keener to work with China than some other of these countries, which had initially hoped to enjoy more Chinese investment than ultimately appeared. But also within the EU, for example, France takes a slightly different view. The French President, Macron, has been to China just recently, and there he also brought up other issues than just trade. He was talking about the Uyghuric minority in China, of course also the complaints that intellectual property in China is not sufficiently protected. So indeed these are aspects that other countries care a lot more about. A recent issue is of course also 5G. the fears that that 5G is not just economical but also political, and then how can China then reassure European countries that it's actually about economics. So these are indeed topics that that are perhaps more prevalent in France, the UK, Germany than in Greece.
These are topics that are appearing in some of the headlines, but it seems that very different countries have very different views, but at the same time, collectively, the EU has not ruled out any specific country or any specific company around the world in terms of who will be the provider of the 5G. In fact, for now, 5G is mainly Huawei, a company that is based headquartered in China. Both the German Chancellor and also many of the European dignitaries, presidents and prime ministers, who have been spoken over the past few weeks have once again touched upon that there has been no ruling out of any specific country and any specific company. So let me go now to a voice really coming from Greece rather than from elsewhere in Europe. In Athens, we have George Zougopoulos, who's a senior research fellow and also director of the EU-China programs at the Centre International de Formation Europe. I hope I pronounce the name of your institute right, because this is in Greek. But for now, sir, it's good to have you on our program. Let me ask you about the immediate reaction to the latest rounds of state visits by Chinese President Xi Jinping, and also interactions between the Greek and also the Chinese leaders.
Thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure.
It is a very important day for Greece, and please allow me to start with this. It is a state visit from a Chinese president after 11 years. It is very important for the future of the bilateral relationship, as well as for Sino-European relations. So far, we have experienced a very good climate in bilateral talks. Several agreements and memoranda of understanding have been signed, so we can be optimistic about the future. And what is very important is to look at the bilateral partnership beyond the Chinese investment in the Piraeus port, which has been very successful. But now it's time for the two countries to look at additional areas of cooperation on energy, telecommunications, culture, education, and tourism. And it is clear that President Xi Jinping and Greek Premier Mitsotakis are determined to proceed.
Now, when you look at the areas which you touch on, whether it's telecommunication or tourism, there actually is energy as well, a lot of ground to cover. For example, Professor Wang, if I could invite a Chinese voice also in this discussion. Professor Wang, 170,000 Chinese tourists every year to Greece now, but that number is expected to increase even further. What would that mean for a economy like that of Greece, and how will that create better people-to-people relationship and understanding? It's not just about the cash. It's really about how do you feel about the other countries. Professor Wang.
Yes, as President Xi has said in his visit, I think Greece represents the ancient European civilization, China, Eastern civilization. So our two Asian civilizations shake hands and also contribute to innovation, and more and more people exchange that to contribute, I think, learn from each other, because today's world we suffer so many crises and uncertainties, so we need more to learn from the Asian civilization. So people-to-people exchange is not just for tourists, it's not just for economy, it's also about maybe the second renaissance and East and West shake hands to contribute to the community of shared future, which the
it might be a little bit too early to announce that they will be two civilizations once again, but certainly it's one of the very first steps. If you think about what Europe has suffered over the past few years in terms of division, in terms of challenges to their economies. But Mr. Zougopoulos, of course, people are also looking at the interests of Greece also. Earlier we had Mr. Klepp coming from the EU trying to suggest that maybe the Greece should take more advantage of this relationship. Now, what do you think is the best way in this regard about a cooperation relationship between China and Greece? What is the realistic expectation coming from Greece about the potential? Mr. Zougopoulos.
Well, I think that the sky is the limit for the bilateral partnership, and the fact that President Xi Jinping is currently in Athens highlights that China wants to do more with Greece, and obviously Greece is interested in doing more with China. We need to mention that Greece is an EU member state. It respects all EU guidelines in receiving investment from China. So from the moment this is happening, why not? More can happen. And that's why Greek citizens and Greek politicians are optimistic about the future. And the memoranda of understanding that have been signed until now highlight that in the future we can expect more indeed, especially in the areas I mentioned before. But of course we should not sideline issues such as tourism, education and culture.
Well, if I could just bring in Mr. Klepp, coming from what he considers as the EU perspective as well. Will Greece, for example, be a new frontier in terms of what to do and how to deal with China? And what could be some of the potential of cooperation between Europe or the European countries of the EU and China, Mr. Klepp? What do you think about that possibility?
I think that's a good point. I think Greece is indeed, let's say, on the forefront of cooperation with China. So indeed, the way Greece fares with China will probably determine how other European countries in the future will relate to China. If indeed Greece, let's say, starts taking huge loans from China, I do think that would be a warning sign. However, if the relationship is purely commercial, then of course indeed the sky is the limit. The more cooperation, the better.
Okay.
Of course, we should still not forget that other European countries, like notably Germany, has already a lot of economic interaction with China. So that's of course also the case.
Yeah, Mr. Tsokopoulos, of course, Mr. Klepp seemed to be more concerned about the debt issue than you in Greece about Greece's future. You want to respond to that?
Well, let me be very clear about this. What is happening is that Greece was under pressure by its creditors, mainly the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, to proceed with privatizations. So transparent tenders were organized, and in some cases only Chinese companies submitted offers. So what Greece could do? Exclude the Chinese companies because they come from China? Let us be very realistic about the past and about the future. What Greece did was completely in line with the regulations of the European Union, and Greece is a member state which respects the guidelines. I don't understand the concern. From the moment Chinese investments in Greece only represent approximately 1% of the Chinese investments in the European Union.
Got it. Professor Wang, you have anything to say about that?
I agree with my Greek colleague. I think that everything because of from China, and the state-owned enterprises, Costco, and everything because Communist Party, so blame everything. But what do the Greek people need? What do the Greek economy really need? I think what the European really need? I think it's more infrastructure building, more mutual connectivity. Now the port, not just connect the sea and the land, but also help the Serbia and Hungary. There's a railway and extend to the south and connect with the support. This is very good for the China-European Union mutual connectivity collaboration.
Right. But before we go, we have 1.5 minutes left. The three gentlemen, may I ask you about, this is only the first step, the port Piraeus, and also the cooperation between China and Greece. And how should we use this as an interesting model if we look at the future, whether it's about Belt and Road cooperation between China and Greece and China and Europe, or some of the other areas when we think about these two very strong economies, that of the European Union and that of China, and certainly Greece is a big and important part of that. Mr. Tsokopoulos, you want to come in first? Very briefly, 30 seconds for every one of you.
Yes, there is a lack of understanding of China in the West, both in the European Union and in the United States. So I think that the successful presence of China in Greece can give important lessons, especially to the European Union. So Greece can be a bridge between the West and the East, and it can really suggest to its partners at the EU level that China cannot be a threat.
Mr. Klepp, Mr. Tsokopoulos already signed that kind of image to Greece. So what do you think will be the potential? 30 seconds.
Well, I think ultimately there is no EU-China trade deal already, so I think at some point that could be a very good thing to achieve. But for that, both sides will have to make major concessions.
I see. Last but not least, Professor Wang, 30 seconds.
The early birds get the wings. So I think Greece benefit first.
We got a lot of ancient wisdoms coming over here, whether it's the sky is the limit, the early birds got the worm, or as deep as the sea. Anyway, for now, I want to thank the three of you for joining us. George Tsokopoulos from Greece, Piet Klep coming from the EU, and Mr. Wang Yiwei from China. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen.